Okay, again, welcome everyone to Justice 101, which is Introduction to Criminal Justice. And this is just going to be a quick overview of some of the key concepts I think that are important to understand as we begin our first week here in Module 1. So what we're going to take a look at here is the criminal justice system and its structure. I really just want you guys to make sure you understand that in the United States, we have what we call a dual criminal justice system. In other words, we have federal courts and we have state courts. And we have law enforcement at the federal level and law enforcement at the state level. And we have corrections at the federal level and we have corrections at the state level. So know that there is that distinction of our dual court system. And in theory, one could be prosecuted for a crime, let's say bank robbery, at both the state level and the federal level, because each of those have jurisdiction over that particular offense. And the same can be true for drug cases and things like that. But just know that the dual criminal justice system exists in the United States. The components are basically the same, the three components: police, courts, and corrections. So at the federal level, you have, things like the FBI or the Secret Service. In the court system, you have the federal court system, and corrections, you have the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And at the state level, you have your local police and state police. You have your state courts and corrections, which is typically run by the state for your prisons, and then jails are run at the local government at the county level. Okay, so just know we do have this dual court system. And the criminal justice system is made up of three core members: the police, the courts, and the corrections. And each of these core members interact with each other constantly in terms of providing the criminal justice service that we are used to in this country. So just remember, we have three components of the criminal justice system. They are police, courts, and corrections. Sometimes if you have a difficult time remembering, it's the three C's: cops, courts, and corrections. All right, but just know that those are the key members of the criminal justice system, and then we'll talk about what each of those are responsible for within our criminal justice system. The police, for example, in terms of duties and responsibilities, they typically enforce specific laws, usually state or local ordinances, investigate specific crimes depending on the jurisdiction. They talk to people, they search buildings, they look for crooks, an array of things that takes place throughout the course of a police officer's day. They may be involved in arrests. They may detain people in order to figure out what happened at a specific situation. And oftentimes they're responsible for maintaining peace and order in our society. So this is just a really basic overview of what the police do. There are many things that the police do that you may have personal experience with, or as you see maybe on some TV shows or things such as Cops and like that, you'll see that the cops do an array of things within our society. Next are the courts, and the courts consist of really two components: the district attorney's office, or the prosecutors, and then the courts themselves, the judges and magistrates. All right, so the prosecutors are involved in things such as filing charges against an individual. For example, a police agency arrests an individual, then that case, along with whatever evidence is outlined in the police report, is reviewed by the district attorney to determine whether or not charges should be filed. And one of the key things is we need to make sure that all the criminal elements of a specific offense have been identified and that the suspect more than likely or not committed a crime. They seek indictments if you're from a state that uses an indictment process, so they'll appear before a grand jury and seek an indictment against a particular individual. They may be involved in dropping charges or not filing charges against an individual. So, for example, a police agency seeks to charge an individual with a crime, and maybe the district attorney believes that the police haven't met their burden. Remember that for the police to arrest someone, it just requires probable cause. but for the courts to convict somebody, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. So the DA's office needs to make sure that they can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. The DA's office may also reduce the charges. So, for example, if a case comes into the prosecutor for consideration, maybe, for example, they arrested the individual for burglary. Maybe the district attorney believes that those charges aren't going to be sustainable, and they may file a reduced charge of theft or something similar like that. The judges or magistrates are involved in all kinds of aspects of the case. They set bail, conditions of release, they accept plea bargains. In juvenile court, they determine delinquency, they can dismiss charges, they impose a sentence, obviously. If someone's on probation and they break those conditions of probation, they can file a revocation and get the person back in jail and no longer on probation. Judges are also involved. A big part of their job too is overseeing a criminal court trial, in which their job is to ensure that the defendant receives a fair trial under the laws of that state and the Constitution. Correction officials, they're involved obviously once a person gets convicted of a crime and the judge imposes some sentence. They are assigned to determine which correctional facility this individual should be sent to if there's more than one within your state, and obviously they oversee their imprisonment. They can also award privileges to imprisoned inmates, in other words, good behavior, things like that, which goes towards hopefully a person's early release. If an individual is sentenced to state prison and they get released, they may be put on parole, or if in lieu of going to prison, you may be placed on probation. And so here you have the paroling authorities. They determine the date and conditions of parole. They can revoke a parole, and the key part of both probation and parole officers is they supervise inmates upon their release, and that's a key part of their job. So if we look at some of the fundamental of the criminal justice process, we can take a look here that there are basically 5 stages in the criminal justice process where one enters the system, and that's usually via the police. You arrest somebody. The prosecution and pretrial services, where in this particular case, let's say the district attorney's office elects to file charges against an individual. Actions take place, either he pleads guilty or he goes to jury trial, and there's some level of adjudication. All right, so if he pleads guilty, he's going to go to be sentenced, and there'll be some sanctions. If it's a jury trial, then he's going to be adjudicated, in other words, found guilty or not guilty. Obviously, if he's found not guilty, he's out of the system. If he's found guilty, then we go to the next phase, which is sentencing and sanctions. What's the punishment going to be? And then some level of corrections, which could be jail, prison, or probation. Those are the different types of corrections that an individual could receive. But I think it's important to understand the fundamentals of the criminal justice process. Okay, so remember that the police are responsible for investigating, arresting, and booking a defendant. If the defendant is to be prosecuted, the next step is the first appearance before a judge. A judge determines whether the charges are legitimate according to statutes, advises the person of his or her legal rights, and determines bail. As a case moves from the police to the prosecutors by a preliminary hearing or to a grand jury, that is often what happens on felony type cases. Generally, you're not going to have a preliminary hearing for a misdemeanor type case. At the arraignment, the defendant is asked whether he or she pleads guilty or not guilty. Guilt or innocence is then determined by the judge if it's a bench trial, or by a jury if it's a jury trial. The judge determines an appropriate sentence for a convicted defendant. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but on felony cases, the judge will receive a pre-sentence investigation report, and that is submitted by a probation officer. And we'll talk more about that here in a couple weeks. The sentence is announced at a sentencing hearing, and the defendant has a right to appeal a verdict based on the alleged judicial errors. So a defendant can challenge a ultimate jury decision based on some type of judicial or legal error that they believe occurred during the trial. And if those errors had not occurred, then the defendant might have been found not guilty. So the convicted defendant is then sentenced, and he may become an inmate in a correctional facility or may be placed on probation. So he could be sentenced to county jail, which is generally for those offenses less than a year or two. More serious offenders go to state prison. Under certain conditions, parole may allow for early release from a correctional facility. So in some states that has a parole system, an individual may serve a percentage of his time, and then based on his behavior, may be eligible for early release and then placed on parole. Okay, so this is basically the 5 stages of the criminal justice system. So this week's your discussion board asks about an interaction within the criminal justice system and how the 3 components work with each other and how they interact with each other. So how do members of the criminal justice system interact with each other? Well, I think anytime if you take a look at the TV show Law and Order, for example, there's always an interaction between the police investigator and the district attorney. So there's a good example of how they interact with each other. Collectively, they're investigating an offense and trying to collect whatever type of evidence is going to be necessary in order for the prosecutor to be able to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt. So therefore, there's a good example of an interaction that takes place between 2 members of the criminal justice system. How do they complement each other? Well, you can take a search warrant, for example. In obtaining a search warrant, a police officer has to prepare an affidavit and a search warrant. In some states or some counties, depending on how it's set up, the investigator may have to take his search warrant to the district attorney first in order for the DA to review the search warrant to make sure that it includes all the necessary legal elements in order to achieve that search warrant. You then will have to take that search warrant to a judge, because ultimately a judge, a neutral and detached magistrate, has to be the one to determine whether or not there's enough probable cause established in the search warrant to look for specific evidence, and it's at the place where the police officer or detective believes it is. So here they complement each other. In theory, once you get your search warrant assigned by a magistrate, it'll be very difficult for a defense lawyer to challenge the search warrant if the officer has been truthful in his affidavit. So that is probably a good example of maybe how they complement each other. When you look at what would happen if one component is broken or malfunctioning, a question you can ask yourself is, what happens, for example, if corrections doesn't allocate sufficient money for rehabilitation and inmates are released back into society with no either work skills, or if whatever caused them, for example, to get in trouble to begin with has not been addressed. So since majority of inmates have a substance abuse problem, if, for example, an inmate has a drug problem and is not offered an opportunity to go through some drug rehabilitation program while he's incarcerated, then he may easily fall back into using drugs again, which means he'll be right back into the system again. The police will arrest him for a crime, the DA will review the case, file charges, he goes back to court, he gets convicted, he goes back to prison. So we're creating this cycle. So that might be an example of where one member of the criminal justice system is broken or malfunctioning, all right? So as you look at these prompts in your discussion board, keep these things in mind and try to come up with other type situations or illustrations that might help demonstrate whether or not the criminal justice system interacts with each other, an example of that, or how they complement each other, or what might happen if one element were to be broken or malfunctioning. So finally, what's to do this week? Read chapters 1 and 2. You have a discussion thread on the 3 branches of the criminal justice system. Make sure you address each prompt. There are several prompts in this week's discussion thread, so it's good if you maybe put the prompt at the top, respond to it, do the next prompt, respond to that, so that way you make sure that you address each of the prompts. In the past, students have left out a prompt, forgot to answer a specific part of the discussion board question, so pay close attention to that. Do the MyCG Lab activity. Remember, you can take it at unlimited times, and then do the quiz, again, unlimited attempts. All right? Have a good week. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.